our fall sermon series, What Disciples Do. And this morning we're looking at the fact that disciples wrestle with God. We've been talking about the fact that being a disciple of Christ is about more than just what we believe, and that it has to impact the way that we live our lives. Now, this is a little bit of a strange story. Bob just kind of gave you the historic context of what's been going on before this. You know, Jacob is headed back home to this brother that he cheated before. And so he's probably a little anxious about what that reunion is going to look like. Jacob ends up wrestling with this partner all night long. Now the text calls this partner a man, but Jacob seems to understand or sees this partner as God. Peniel, where he names this place, means face of God because Jacob says, I have seen the face of God. Well, eventually this wrestling partner does bless Jacob, but he also leaves him with a limp. This is kind of an odd story. It's a story of ambiguity and mystery. But when we stop to think about it, our journey of faith is often filled with ambiguity and mystery. And wrestling with God can be a powerful metaphor for that life of faith that we lead. Now, how many of you remember 1973, the first light beer, Miller Lite? Remember the tastes great.
Let's filling.
There we go, right? And soon after, lots of other light products followed, right? Light potato chips. I love light syrup. I'm not so sure about that, right? But my point in all this is that sometimes when we are not willing to wrestle with God, we end up with faith light. We end up not dealing and not delving as deeply as we should into our faith. Sometimes we are, it seems, afraid to dig too deeply into what it means to follow God. Sometimes we are afraid to wrestle with God, and I think there can be multiple reasons for that. Some of us, we talked at dinner church last night, did not have good experiences when we were children with asking questions, being told that you don't ask those kinds of questions, right? So maybe we're afraid that we're going to offend God if we wrestle with God, if we question our faith. Maybe we're afraid of how others will react to our questioning, that they'll think that somehow we're not real Christians because we're not, because we're wrestling with something, because we're asking questions. Maybe we're afraid that it will somehow weaken our faith, that by delving too deeply, that we'll get on some kind of slippery slope where one belief falls and another belief falls and we'll be left with nothing at the end. To be honest, I think too, sometimes we're just lazy. We don't want to be challenged too deeply or confronted with mysteries too deep or involved in relationships that might be inconvenient. But the truth is that disciples should not be satisfied with simplistic answers and pious platitudes, especially during times of struggle. This is a story of Jacob wrestling with God and gaining a hard-fought, hard-won relationship formed in the dark on the muddy banks of a river. The Bible is filled with stories of people who wrestle with God, who wrestle with their faith and what that means. United Methodist pastor and author Martin Thielen writes, after years of praying for a child with no results, Abraham and Sarah wrestled with God. Frustrated with leading people of Israel through the wilderness, Moses wrestled with God. Sick in body, mind, and spirit, Job wrestled with God. Hiding for his life in a desert cave, his enemies in hot pursuit, David wrestled with God. Crying out to God in anger and anguish, the prophet Jeremiah wrestled with God. Believing God had abandoned him, the psalmist wrestled with God. After repeatedly praying for healing but not receiving it, the Apostle Paul wrestled with God. In anguish over his inability to believe Jesus was alive, Thomas wrestled with God. And I would add that fearing the pain and abandonment that was to come, even Jesus wrestled with God in the Garden of Gethsemane. Wrestling with God is a crucial activity for us as disciples. Without it, our faith remains shallow. It remains untested. Our faith will end up being weaker if we refuse to wrestle with it than if we do. And there are several areas that we need to wrestle with when it comes to our faith. First of all, we need to wrestle with theological concepts, with theological beliefs, and we need to do this personally and as a church. Who or what is God? What is God like? What's the meaning of salvation? Who is saved? How are they saved? What's the meaning of suffering? Does it have meaning? So we need to wrestle with these big questions because they will influence how we live out our faith. But we also need to wrestle with the Bible. And as Baptists, this should be second nature for us, because Bible freedom is one of the 4 basic freedoms that we cling to as our Baptist heritage. The idea that we have both the right and the responsibility with the community, under the direction of Christ, using good scholarship to wrestle with the Scripture and what it means and what it says and how it should be applied to our life. So asking questions like, how much of the Bible is literal? And how much is metaphorical or poetic? How should we deal with the contradictory messages that are in the Bible? What takes precedence? You know, there are places in the Bible where slaves are told to obey your masters. And then there are other places in the Bible where Paul says there is no longer slave or free. Which has precedence? Women in leadership. Again, there are places in the Scripture where it says, Paul says, I do not allow a woman to teach, right? But then there are multiple places in the Scripture where Paul references women who are in leadership in the churches that he has founded. And throughout Israeli Hebrew history, we see women who are judges and leaders in their own ways. What about the treatment of outsiders? How about the way that we have treated Native Americans and immigrants? And it's not just the latest round of immigration that's a problem throughout our history. At different times, the Irish were not welcome. The Chinese were not welcome. The Italians were not welcome, right? Again, there's places in the Scripture that say, welcome the stranger, take in the foreigner. There's other places where it says, go and annihilate everybody who's different than you. Which one has precedence? What is biblical marriage? Abraham married his half-sister. Jacob had 2 wives and 2 handmaids. David had 8 wives, plus a whole bunch of concubines. Paul said it was better to remain unmarried. So what is the biblical view of marriage? We have to wrestle with these things. We have to decide. We all interpret the Bible in one way or another. And I'm going to add something else to this. You also, as a congregation, need to wrestle with the biblical interpretation of the Bible by your pastor. Yes, I've gone to seminary. Yes, partially you pay me to study Scripture and present it to you. But I'm human. And I'm fallible. And I have my own biases. And so How many of you grew up in any kind of church where, if the pastor said it, that's just the way it is, and you just have to accept it? Yeah? I'm seeing quite a few hands, right? I'm telling you, you don't. And that's really not healthy. Because pastors, like anybody else, can get skewed. We are a community of faith, and we are meant to be a counterbalance to one another. So just because I say it doesn't make it gospel. I hope that I have some good insight because I do make this my focus, but you also have to keep a balance. So, we need to wrestle with theological concepts. We need to wrestle with the Bible. We also need to wrestle with the implications of the gospel. We need to recognize and wrestle with the implications of the gospel on our personal life. How does it influence the way we live out our relationships? The people around us. How does our faith influence what job we take or don't take? And how we comport ourselves at that job? How does that faith shape our values and our character and our priorities? But the church also needs to wrestle with the implications of the gospel. Again, our relationships to one another, our relationships to the neighbors around us, our relationship to those who are different from us. How is the church to react to those situations? What does the gospel have to say about our mission in this time and this place, who God is calling us to be? How does the gospel influence how we are to spend our money as a congregation? We're going to have that conversation later today. But we also need to struggle with the implications of the gospel in our society. How do we grapple with the challenges that come up in the world? How, in Jesus' time, perhaps they would wrestle with how do they reflect on the Babylonian exile or the Roman persecution. In our time, it might be things like the Holocaust and Hiroshima. How do we wrestle with those things? How do we wrestle? What implications does the gospel have when we think about things like nuclear weapons and climate change and joblessness and despair? We are called to wrestle with social issues like abortion and immigration and capital punishment and same-sex marriage. Our faith has implications for our world, or it should if we take it seriously. And as I said before, this is not new. People have been wrestling with faith since faith began. Think about it, just in our own U.S. history. Slavery was seen as condoned by the Bible until it wasn't. Divorce was seen to put you outside of the possibility of leadership in the church until it wasn't. Women were not allowed to teach, preach. When I was growing up, they weren't even allowed to start communion, right? Until they were. In each of these cases, the church had to wrestle with God and wrestle with the faith to decide how it is that we are called in this time and place to be disciples of Jesus Christ. One of the valuable things about seminary education is that they basically take you in and they completely tear your faith down. And as long as you have a strong faith, that's okay, because then they help you rebuild it. They make you look at every single thing you believe and wrestle with it and struggle with it, so that when you come out, your faith is not just the faith that you learned growing up. It's not just what the preacher said. It's not just what the Sunday school teacher said. It's not just what your mom and dad taught you. But you have wrestled with it. You've wrestled with God. And you can say, this is where I stand for now. Because that's the other piece of it, right? It's a journey. And where I stand right now, I hope I continue to wrestle with God until the day that I die. And I'm sure that I still have a lot to learn and a long ways to grow, and that God is going to continue to work on me. Our wrestling match with God is never done. In wrestling with God, Jacob saw God, it says, face to face. Jacob caught a glimpse of God, but it was only a glimpse. We have to live in the mystery of the fact that God is bigger and more mysterious and deeper than we can comprehend. And when we wrestle, we catch a glimpse. But that wrestling match has to go on and on because we don't get the full picture. We have to realize that God is both loving and judging. That God is fully trustworthy and wholly unpredictable. That God is the source of life and strength and a force beyond human control or comprehension. Wrestling with God brought Jacob a limp. And we, when we wrestle, have to be willing to let go, to live with the implications of our wrestling. To be willing to let go of those things that we need to let go of. To do the hard work of going deeper and deeper with God. And while wrestling brought a limp, it also brought great blessing. Such is the mystery, the pain, and the beauty of wrestling with God. There was a church service where the pastor was blessing the high school seniors who were graduating. And he said this to them. He said, "Our hope and prayer for you today is that you will spend the rest of your life wrestling with God." And as your pastor, that is my hope and prayer for each and every one of you. Whether you are 8 or 88, I pray that every day you will wrestle with God. That you will wrestle with what it means to follow Christ and be his disciple. That your faith will be real to you. And that each day